And it's taking some time to load, like it always does. Please stand by. Turn on the comments, just in case anybody would like to ask a question or add to the conversation. There we go. All right. It is now up and running and only 1 minute past 12. That's not bad. Technology seems to be smoother today. Let's hope that holds. Uh, let's go ahead and get down to work. So thank you so much for joining me for our study today of Parashat Emor. Like always, we are not going to cover the entire parasha. I leave that to your own time and study, but instead look at a slice of the parasha, which may reveal through its many different facets, many different things that are worthy of consideration. In particular, we're going to be picking up here in chapter 22, starting our reading at verse 26. But I should warn you, we are going to slice it fine today. That is to say, we are going to be looking at only one verse eventually, although the context will be important as we launch into that discussion. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get down to work. So, like I said, chapter 22 of Vayikra, verse 26. Adonai said to Moshe, saying, an ox or a sheep or a goat, when it is born, shall remain 7 days under its mother. And from the 8th day and forward, it will be accepted as a near offering, as a fire offering to Adonai. If you're not familiar with Everett Fox's terminology, when he uses the term near offering, he is trying to capture the root word of korban, the general word translated as sacrifice, which of course also means to draw near to something. So he is sort of trying to put that together as our understanding. And then, of course, Ishay is the fire offering, as he mentioned. So what do we have here? We have a piece of sacrificial legislation saying that when an animal has been born, that there is a delay, a grace period, if you will, between its birth and when it is finally capable of being offered as a sacrifice. Thus, an animal that is born cannot be sacrificed on the same day. And yes, it is not, I think, coincidental, nor do the commentaries, that it is on the 8th day that this changes status. Of course, 8 days after birth should also immediately put us in mind of the Brit Milah, the circumcision of a boy on the 8th day after his birth as well. And then as we continue with verse 28, and an ox or a sheep, it and its young, you are not to slaughter on one day. When you sacrifice a sacrifice of thanksgiving to Adonai for acceptance, you are to sacrifice it. On that day it is to be eaten. You are not to let any of it remain until morning. I am Adonai. So again, we see a continuation of the animal legislation, not what we have seen so much prior to this, which is exactly what counts as a blemish, a mum on an animal that would disqualify it for sacrifice. But here, its relationship status to its own family is what is disqualifying it. So if you have a cow and you have a calf, or then they cannot be sacrificed, cannot be slaughtered indeed on the same day. Yes, they both can be sacrificed, but they cannot be sacrificed on the same day. It would have to be sequential in order to, well, as Rambam argues, in order to make sure that we are not growing callous through our performance of the sacrificial offering. That Rambam argues quite convincingly that many of these laws are here not just for the benefit of the animal, which unfortunately some humans may or may not be indifferent to, but are also for the benefit of humans, which we hope that even more humans will care about. Namely that as humans, we are constantly in need of tending to our sense of compassion and rightness in the world. And one of the places where that is often tested is in our behavior towards animals. If we are more guarded in how we deal with animals, treat them with proper feeling, affection, and compassion, even when we need to slaughter them for sacrifice or for food, then we will protect those general feelings within ourselves, which we will then also use in our dealings with the other members of humanity. So this is not just about the animals, it is also about how we treat each other. But to treat each other right, we also need to continue to maintain that rightness even when dealing with animals, which unfortunately, as I mentioned, some people, a proportion of our population, do not always seem to care about enough. And then the eating of the sacrifice on the day that it was offered, or at least some of these sacrifices, is reinforced here. But the real reinforcement is coming here at the end of this section. Let's see, I think I can get all of those. Nope, I can't get it and the Hebrew all in one, so we'll have to scroll when we get there. So beginning with verse 31, you are to keep my commandments and observe them. I am Adonai. You are not to profane my holy name, that I may be hallowed amid the children of Israel. I am Adonai, the one who hallows you, who is bringing you out of the land of Egypt to be a God for you. I am Adonai. So this section beginning here, excuse me, beginning here with verse 31 is a very powerful synopsis of the underlying relationship between us and God. And indeed, it is playing off the same themes that we introduced when we began talking about holiness many chapters ago. And it is reminding us of that essential nature that we have an obligation to sanctify God. Now, that is more unusual than it might sound. And it's something that can be very confusing if we're not thinking about the language clearly. So when we say that we are sanctifying God, well, first of all, we see that that is coming in relationship to verse 31, that means that we are observing the commandments, that we are following the commandments. But the basic idea is that we are giving voice, we are giving evidence, we are giving testimony to God's holiness through our behavior, through our life, through our actions. And that the opposite is also true, that if we behave in other ways, other than God has commanded us, then we will be desecrating God's name. We will be profaning it. Chilul Hashem is the common term used. So just as there is Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of God, or God's name as a stand-in for God, there is also Chilul Hashem, the desecration, the profanation, the profaning, that's probably better English, of God's name. And those two opposites are, well, tricky. How do we understand which is which, and how do we understand what that means? That is to say, it's all very well and good to say that we are sanctifying God's name when we observe the commandments, and we are profaning God when we are breaking the commandments. But exactly what does that look like in detail? As I have said on multiple occasions, and hopefully you have all heard, but if not, repetition is important. The details matter. Slogans are nice, and having statements like "you will be holy" or "you will not profane my name," that's great and wonderful, and it's easier to remember than all the details off the top of our head. But if we do not explore the details, then we will miss out on what we are actually meant to do. Because left to our own devices, many of us would be, well, let's be diplomatic, would be sloppy in our sanctification of God, and we would be perhaps inadvertently prone to desecration of God's name. So we're going to take a look at exactly what that means to both sanctify and desecrate. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there are a number of different areas of Jewish life where this comes into play, that this very simple statement impacts much of what we do in Judaism. So before we dive in, I'll, as always, give a quick shout out if there are any questions. I'll double check on the live stream feed to see if anybody's asking there. I'll double check again later, because unfortunately I can't keep that open at the same time as I do this. All right, so let's go ahead then and dive in to some of the ways we can understand this notion of Kiddush Hashem. So the first way we're going to understand it is perhaps the most rare in, I hope, our history, but also one of the more powerful ways that this term is used, the sanctification of God. So here we are reading from Mishnah Torah, from Rambam's great text on Jewish law. The entire house of Israel is commanded regarding the sanctification of the great name, as Leviticus 22:32, which is what we just read, says, "And I shall be sanctified amidst the children of Israel." They are warned against desecrating it in the same verse, and they shall not desecrate or profane my holy name. That is to say, not desanctify that name. What is implied? See, Rambam recognizes that we need details, and indeed, basing it off the Talmud, the details have been gone over. Should a Gentile arise and force a Jew to violate one of the Torah's commandments at the pain of death, he should violate the commandment rather than be killed. Because, as Leviticus 18:5 states, which we read just a little while ago, about the mitzvot, which a man will do and live by them. That is to say, one may live by them and not die because of them. If a person dies rather than transgress, he is held accountable for his life. All right, now, it might seem odd to you that this is what we're starting with, because after all, if I'm going to sanctify God's name, doesn't that mean I should martyr myself? Somebody has come and they are forcing the Jews to break commandments. Shouldn't I let myself be killed? I mean, that's what a martyr is, right? Well, yes, but Rambam, based off our rabbinic tradition, rightly understands that we need to begin with first principles. And the first principle is that is not the actual sanctification of God's name that is most desired. The true sanctification of God's name is that a person will live according to the commandments, that we sanctify God by living a life according to the commandments. And under certain horrible circumstances, we might then have to question that position. So if somebody comes and points the gun at you and says, "Enjoy this bacon sandwich or else I'll shoot you," we have to then decide, would I be sanctifying God's name by refusing to eat and letting them shoot me? Or would I be sanctifying God's name by eating it? Because then I would be upholding the notion that we are meant to live by the commandments rather than die by them. Now, the answer, according to the Talmud, which Rambam is codifying here, is that we should eat the sandwich. That indeed, under normal circumstances, the sanctification of God's name comes from living according to the mitzvot rather than dying for the mitzvot. And this has been a rather important principle throughout Jewish life. If our ancestors had all chosen at any time an edict was rendered against us to die rather than to sanctify God's name through living and violating a commandment under that duress, well, we would not be here. That is to say, we are the descendants of those who followed what Rambam is describing here as the proper course of action, which is when forced with a choice between observing a mitzvah and surrendering breaking a mitzvah or surrendering one's life, one chooses to break the mitzvah. And that is Rambam's opening salvo in this notion of Kiddush Hashem, of sanctifying God's name. Now, we're not going to go into it, but I highly recommend you read through chapter 5 of Foundations of the Torah that are cited here. You can find it all on Sefaria in English. There are some exceptions. That is to say, if you are asked to commit idolatry, to commit murder, or to commit something like adultery or incest, then one should choose to lay down one's life than transgress those. There are many more nuances to that, and many more nuances regarding whether it is done in public or whether it is done in private. But suffice it to say, the basic principle is that God is sanctified through the living first and foremost, and only under exceptional circumstances do we refuse to break a commandment at the cost of our life. Needless to say, when it comes to personal survival in non-sectarian issues, where you're adrift on a boat and the only thing to eat is a can of Spam, there is even less question. Of course, we break the commandment and eat the can of Spam. But I do highly recommend continuing the rest of chapter 5 at your own leisure. It is a fascinating discussion of what our people have had to face, endure, and how we have tried to reconcile our desire to maintain the commandments even in the face of great opposition with our desire to continue to live so that the commandments will continue to exist in this world. Now, that is one way of understanding both the sanctification or the desecration of God's name. Indeed, dying unnecessarily would be considered a desecration. But this same phrase of that we will not profane God's name can also be used in a different context. And we're going to look at that through the words of the Chofetz Chaim, one of the more modern commentators who made his mark especially on the topic of Lashon Hara. Lashon Hara is often translated as gossip. It is a imperfect translation, however. Lashon Hara can be both gossip as well as rumor mongering. It can be also the slander of someone. It can also be telling truths that are inappropriate to be told, either to that particular person or under that particular set of circumstances. It is a complicated topic, one that I've done other classes on, in my Pathway to Judaism course in particular, but it's one that we're going to look at a snippet of his description of some of the mitzvot we violate when we engage in this Lashon Hara, when we engage in this verbal transgression. So we're going to look at, this is technically number 5 in his list. Number 6 is from our text, but number 5 is too good to pass up, and I had room on the page. And the speaker of Lashon Hara also transgresses Deuteronomy 8, that's the book of Devarim. Take heed unto yourself, lest you forget the Lord your God, which is an exhortation to the proud of spirit, people who are arrogant. For since he mocks and ridicules his friend, he apparently considers himself wise and a man among men. After all, if you feel that you are standing in a place where you can mock someone else, where you can engage in Lashon Hara of someone else, then you must have a very high opinion of yourself to feel that you are the right person to do that. For if he knew his own faults, he would not deride his friend. After all, anyone who has true humility would recognize that even if what you are pointing out about another is true, that it is certainly no different than the faults that are found within yourself. I said there are some many details of Lashon Hara. Of course, there are times when one can point out criminal faults or other types of truly negative behavior. But at the moment, we're talking about more general issues. And especially if in shaming his friend, he honors himself, he certainly transgresses this negative commandment. As aside from our rabbis and their Holy Spirit having cut him off from the world to come, saying in the Yerushalmi, one who honors himself by the shame of his friend has no share in the world to come. So the sages, as quoted in the Yerushalmi, were so aghast at the idea that a person would try to honor themselves by tearing down someone else, by embarrassing someone else. Again, even if what they are saying is true, it's not only about lies, but even when what you said is true, but you did it in a way to embarrass, and that does embarrass another person so that you would seem greater in comparison, that is something that receives the hyperbolic statement that it cuts you off from the world to come. That is how strongly our tradition views this kind of behavior, and how far we should go to distance ourselves from it. Now, on topic for our verses from today, the 6th in the list of transgressions that Lashon Hara can bring us to, the speaker and the receiver, meaning the person who willingly sits and listens to Lashon Hara, also transgresses our verse, and you shall not profane my holy name. Now, you may be thinking, well, how is giving Lashon Hara a Chilul Hashem? How am I desecrating God's name? I may be desecrating my friend's name. I may be explaining why I think he's, terrible, and I may be ruining his reputation and his family and his business and all those things. But that doesn't involve God. That's just between me and him. Well, in that there is no lust or physical pleasure to cause this Yetzer to intensify itself over him, so that the sin is regarded as rebellion and blatant divesting oneself of the yoke of heaven, and he profanes the name of heaven thereby. So what the Chofetz Chaim is saying is, look, when you sit down and there's a bacon double cheeseburger smelling in front of you so wonderfully, and your mouth begins to water and your stomach is grumbling, we understand why a person picks up and bites, even though they know it's a violation of the commandment, and not to save their life in this situation, we know that it is their giving in to their desire. It's giving in to their Yetzer Hara. It's giving in to their appetites, and that's what led them to the action. Likewise, for other physical or other types of transgressions, there is very often some element of, especially our body, that is appealing to us to go ahead and violate, and sometimes we allow ourselves to be led in that direction. That is an understandable, while still a violation, it is an understandable stumbling in the observance of the commandments. However, when it comes to deliberately joining in Lashon Hara against another person, well, how is that filling your belly? How is that satiating the desires of your body? What is that giving you from the body that you inhabit that could be called a true lust or physical desire? This may be a psychological desire, but a psychological desire is one that we should have even greater control over. After all, our bodies are, yes, this powerful machine that can dump all sorts of chemicals into us and lead us into all sorts of problems. But our mind, our soul, our spirit is supposed to be more under our control. When we give in to our temptation to dishonor another person, what we are actually doing is setting aside our belief in God for that moment without any extenuating circumstance, without any external or physical temptation upon which we can lay at least some of the blame. Instead, we are directly and completely rebelling against God for no benefit that our body is leading us towards, but only for our own psychological satisfaction. And that makes it a form of rebellion rather than a form of merely giving in to temptation. As such, Chofetz Chaim is saying that we are actually profaning God's name to a much higher degree when we commit Lashon Hara than we would if we were sitting down and eating that double bacon cheeseburger. I know that many people, especially those of us who are passionate about trying to keep the commandments of all types, occasionally do seem to act as though we care more about things like kashrut than we do about Lashon Hara. And that's why Chofetz Chaim, when he wrote, felt it so necessary to explain to people that Lashon Hara, in the eyes of our tradition and in the eyes of Torah, sits at a higher level of cautionary exhortations, that this is where we need to really build up the walls within ourselves to protect ourselves, because of transgression here is of much serious consequence, much more serious consequence, both to others, but also to ourselves than we might readily acknowledge or realize. He continues, this, even in the instance of a plain Jew, it's bad translation, it basically means, one of the regular people, how much more so in the instance of a man of eminence, whom they all look up to for guidance, where the name of heaven is certainly profane. And he introduces this notion that God's name can be profaned even more by one that is receiving honor from the community. So if this is somebody that is what might be called a macher, certainly if they were a teacher, a rabbi, or other official member of the leadership of a community, if they engage in this type of behavior, then they are all the more so dragging God's name into disrepute. And that is something that we need to consider, that this desecration of God's name is not just that we have, it's not just a euphemism for a violation of a commandment, but the desecration of God's name is also a diminishment of God's honor in this world, that we are making God less attractive to the rest of the world, that we are showing the rest of the world that our observance of the commandments is not actually motivated by our love and desire to serve the Holy One, but that in fact the Holy One has very little power in the world, or indeed, perhaps if somebody is truly ignorant, God forbid, they might think our behavior is representative of God and of God's commandments, and thus they may, in their disgust at our behavior, become disgusted in God in turn. So this position of authority, of honor, makes it even worse if a person will behave in this way. And of course, to add additional levels, and how much more so if the sin were committed in public, would it be extremely grave, the transgressor being called a desecrator of the name of God in public. And that is considered to be one of the worst levels that a person can achieve within the community. All right. If there are any questions, let me pause for a drink. Okay, so we've talked about two different ways of looking at this Kiddush Hashem and Chilul Hashem, of sanctifying God's name, of desecrating God's name. We've looked at what many people would consider to be the biggest, most profound statement of whether one martyrs or doesn't martyr oneself. We've looked at what is a more interpersonal issue regarding how one behaves with regards to Lashon Hara, of whether one brings God into disrepute through our behavior or whether we avoid that. But there is another meaning to this whole idea of sanctifying God's name. And that is one that hopefully we all encounter on a more regular basis, which is to say tefillah, in prayer. What is implied by communal prayer? Again, we are looking at Rambam, but a different section. One prays aloud and all listen. This should not be done with fewer than 10 free adults. The leader of the congregation is one of them, meaning that if you have 9 people listening and 1 person praying, you have what we call a minyan. Even if some of them have already prayed and fulfilled their obligation, they can complete the 10 provided the majority of the 10 have not prayed. In Judaism, we don't believe that a person can be an instrument for creating a minyan unless they are also within the realm of obligation. Here, though, the accommodation is made that even if you have fulfilled your obligation and thus you are not obligated for this prayer, meaning you prayed and then, for example, you're in a high Jewish population area, you've prayed and then you're walking down the street and someone sticks their head out and says, hey, we need one more for a minyan. Even if you've already done Shacharit, for example, you can go in and be that extra person, even though you don't have the obligation for that prayer at that moment, having already done it, you do have the obligation in general. And as long as the majority still have the obligation for that prayer at that moment, then the additional can come from people who have discharged the obligation of that prayer at that moment, provided they do have the obligation in general. We can go over that another time if that was confusing. So every 10 Jews is called a congregation. Right? We know that this is built off 10. Why? Because it says in Numbers 14, how long must I suffer this evil congregation? They were 10, for Joshua and Caleb were not included. Okay, what are we talking about here? We're talking about the spies. In the book of Bamidbar, 12 spies are sent up to assay the land of Israel. And when they come back, all but 2 of them give horrible reports, which lead the congregation, the community, into despair. And this is how we end up not getting to Israel for 40 years after the Exodus. So in that section, the term congregation is used, this evil congregation. Well, by process of math, if there were 12 who went up and 2 who came back with a fine report, then the evil congregation must be the remainder, which, even I can do that math, is 10 people. So therefore, 10 people count as a congregation. We have a similar idea as well in the opposite direction when Abraham is talking to Adonai about the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah of the plain, that if there are 10 people, that the cities will be spared. So we have 10 as a key number for a community. And what happens when you have that community? Any holy matter may only be done in a congregation of Jews, meaning with 10 people. As it states in Leviticus 22:32, our verse, and I shall be sanctified among the children of Israel. So the rabbis here are playing heavily on the wording that it's not just I'll be sanctified by Israel, but specifically among them, meaning that it has to be among this group that can be called a congregation, that can be called a group of the people of Israel, that there has to be a significant quorum. And by defining it through the text of Numbers 14, we reach the idea that that quorum is 10. So 10 people, now we have a minyan, now we can engage in, quote, the sanctification of God's name, the holy matters. Now, there are technical rules for that, and many more you can find here in chapter 8 of this section of Mishnah Torah, but the usual that you might be familiar with are things like the Kaddish, or the Kedusha in the Amidah, or indeed the repetition of the Amidah in its entirety, which includes the Kedusha, or the Baruch, or the public reading of the Torah for a formal service where the aliyot are conducted, the blessings are recited, etc. Those are the general places where we need a minyan, or else we are incorrectly conducting ourselves at that time. And all of those have in their essence a sense that this involves the sanctification of God, that by having 10 gather together, that we are creating the necessary critical mass, that there is a sanctification of God. Now, that is probably going to get you scratching your head. Well, can't I sanctify God's in private? I mean, after all, certainly if I am in a private situation, going back to our first text, as Rambam described, and they are asking me to murder someone, or else I'm going to be killed myself, and I choose to allow myself to die, we would definitely call that Kiddush Hashem, even if it is done entirely in private. I have sanctified God's name by martyring myself rather than murdering another person. But, like I said, this phrase has many different layers to it. And when we talk about the sanctification of God through prayer and community activity, we have this notion of 10. Now, why 10? Well, that's going to be something we're going to talk about in the next section. But in the next section, we're going to talk about it not just in this technical term of, well, there were 10 people left of the spies that were bad, but we're also going to talk about what that 10 achieves. But the actual text we'll be reading from serves a dual purpose. Not only will it lead us into that discussion, but it will also lead us into a discussion which is near and dear to my own heart, and hopefully to many of yours, which is the role of women within the Jewish world. You may have noticed up to this point, I have been very deliberately using the phrase people when talking about the minyan, about the quorum of 10. As some of you may know, this is not a universal position. There are some who hold that in order to be counted in a minyan, you must be a man. And there are others, primarily in the conservative movement, that hold that anyone that is an adult that is Jewish will also count in that minyan, meaning men and women. So how do we get to that point? Well, let's first of all look at some of the arguments around it, which will help us understand this notion of minyan in general, and then we'll look at a summary of the conservative position at the end. Oops, and I lost my mouse. There we are. Some argue that in instances in which a minyan is required, but in which women share equal obligations with men, halakha indeed provides that they may be counted equally with men for purposes of the necessary quorum. So the idea here would be that rather than only looking at things like prayer, we look at other topics where there also is a minyan needed, and where we can say that there is incontrovertibly an equal obligation between men and women. You may remember earlier on, we discussed the idea that men who have already davened shacharit can still nonetheless help with a minyan, as long as the majority of the people in that second minyan have not yet done shacharit, because there is always a question of whether or not the people who are the constituents are actually obligated to the deed. For only if you are obligated, share equally in that obligation, can you actually be considered as either a leader of the service or as somebody who helps makes the quorum. So the question then becomes, outside of tefillah, this is a part of a much longer conversation as you can guess, are there other instances where we look for a minyan, where we don't have a debate about whether women and men are both equally obligated to prayer? And the answer is yes, we do have other such situations, and let's take a look at them. Just as a little FYI, if you're not familiar, in the rabbinic period, women were not often considered equally obligated for prayer because women often were not considered equally obligated for mitzvot that were required to be done at particular times. Now, that's not 100% hard and fast rule. There are many different exceptions to that. But as a general rule of thumb, this was a position of rabbinic teachings for a very long time, primarily because women were, by and large, through the social structure of the time, not always free to choose for themselves what they would be doing at any particular time. If their husband or other male relatives had other tasks that they assigned them, oftentimes the social pressure of the time meant that they would have to deal with those first rather than dealing with the time-bound mitzvot, such as praying services at their particular time. In order to avoid that conflict, the rabbis said that women were not obligated to those time-bound mitzvot, apart from the exceptions, and that would then relinquish them from the tension that they might feel. But let's look at the ones where nobody argues about whether or not women are obligated and see what we can learn from that. Rabbeinu Nissim rules that women who are obligated to hear the reading of the Megillah may be counted as part of the minyan for this purpose. That is to say, women must hear the Megillah. It's not something that is only for men. Again, an example of a time-bound mitzvot that is obligatory to women as well. And as such, since they have that obligation, if in the room there were 6 men and 4 women, you would have enough of a minyan to officially read the Megillah with the brachot, with the blessings, and all of the normal ceremony, because they are equally obligated, thus they form the quorum. Some authorities maintain that the same is true with regard to the mitzvah of the sanctification of divine name. The verse, "and I will be sanctified among the children of Israel," our verse, is also understood as meaning that martyrdom is not commanded other than in the presence of at least 10 Jews. So, as I mentioned in the continuation of that chapter 5 in Rambam's Mishnah Torah about sanctifying God's name through martyrdom, there are some exceptions for when one should sanctify, and one of them is when there is a public display designed intentionally to tear down the authority of Adonai and the roots of Judaism. In such a place, when there is an actual minyan that is observing this formal position, then it is, in many cases, the ideal to go ahead and be martyred. Indeed, this is the situation that we see in the story of Hanukkah, where Matisahu is being asked to perform a pagan sacrifice in the middle of the town as a political statement against Judaism itself. Which is, of course, why he rebelled, and we end up with the story of Hanukkah. Now, in such a situation, since women also are obligated under horrible circumstances to sometimes martyr themselves, then we do understand that they would count as part of the 10 that might make that circumstance a reality. Since the obligation with regard to sanctification of the divine name is equally incumbent upon both men and women, women are to be counted as part of the quorum. So here we have at least a few authorities agreeing that whether it be for the reading of the Megillah or whether it be for the purposes of martyrdom, women do count as part of the minyan in those cases. Now, here we get the pushback on that. This particular source is an Orthodox one. So while it is always refreshing to hear an Orthodox source quote other traditional sources which do not agree with the majority opinion in Orthodoxy, it is not surprising that the source will eventually come back to the Orthodox position. Despite the cogency of this rationale, it serves as a satisfactory explanation only for the authorities citing it in its support, which is one of my favorite phrases, which is basically saying, you know, this makes a lot of sense, but as much sense as it makes, the fact is only the people who actually quote it, who actually believe it, consider it satisfactory. The other people, meaning the majority of the Orthodox authorities, reject it. It may be perfectly legitimate and logical, but it is rejected by the majority opinion within the Orthodox world. Now, why? Well, we can come back to that if we end up with time, but let's look at what the standard Orthodox opinion looks like. The Ramah, which is part of Shulchan Aruch, says he clearly rejects the view of Rabbeinu Nisim. Ramah does state that there is room to question whether or not women may be counted among the 10. However, Ramah's question is quoted in the name of Hagahot Ashrei, who explains that this expression of doubt is based on entirely different considerations. All right, so first of all, notice that Ramah himself does still leave some room, which again was a hallmark of good scholarship until the modern period, where it became much more monolithic in opinions. But at the time, yes, you would quote even people you disagreed with. Even if you were going to rule in a different direction, you wanted to make sure that people understood, one, that you knew of the alternatives, and two, that you were aware that other people would actually still follow those alternatives. Now, what is this difference of consideration? Well, Hagahot Ashrei expresses doubt as to whether a minyan in the usual sense of the term is required for the reading of the Megillah, in which case women are to be excluded, or whether the requirement of the quorum is not for the purposes of constituting a congregation, but in order to publicize the miracle of Purim. If the latter, for publicity, is indeed the case, the requirement is not at all for the presence of a minyan as a congregation, but for publicizing the miracle, which coincidentally also necessitates the presence of 10 individuals. Okay, so the idea here is that there are minyans and there are minyans. There is a minyan that is fulfilling the congregation as derived from the text of Bamidbar, of the 10 bad spies being representative of the congregation. And then there is a minyan derived from how many people do you need to have before something can truly be called public. And that coincidentally happens to be 10. That they are not actually derived from the same underlying logic, rationale, or source, but instead it is coincidence that the number 10 happens to be the magic number, both for constituting a congregation as well as for constituting what might be called a crowd, a public setting. Women are excluded then from the constitution of the quorum, which is needed to form a congregation, but in the case of the reading of the Megillah, it follows that this effect is achieved equally, whether in the presence of women or of men. So if you are going to slice it this way, then when we need a congregation, they don't count. But when we just need a crowd, then they do count. Now, I would argue, before we go further, because I have prerogative of interjecting, that is a distinction without a difference in classic speak, meaning that it is precisely because of the crowdedness that we end up with 10 as the congregation, that it is about sanctifying God's name in public, whether it be through martyrdom, or whether it be through publicizing the miracle of Purim, or whether it be through the observance of the various rites that require God's name to be sanctified in public, such as the Kedusha, the Kaddish, or reading of the Torah. That all of those are based off the same principle, which is that God's name is ultimately sanctified primarily and most powerfully through a crowd rather than just an individual. That, as is our basic reason for existence, we are trying to bring God through the vehicle of the mitzvot, through the vehicle of Torah, into the world in a way that will be noticed, recognized, and then lauded as wonderful by the rest of the world. Well, that means that there has to be an element of publicity, that there has to be a group that is being uplifted and that will then take what they saw, what they witnessed, and share it with the rest of the world. The same way that whenever we are doing a service at the congregation and we have that minyan, we can feel that those 10 people will make an impact not only on their own life, but in the broader world. This is, after all, exactly why the 10 people who came back with the bad report from the land of Israel, the bad spies, corrupted the entire congregation. It's also why 10 people could have saved all of Sodom and Amorah, because there would have been enough in that 10 to spread outwards. There could have been a growth that would eventually push back against that darkness. And for that to work, do we really care whether it is a man or a woman? or isn't it fundamentally about publicity? And while we may still have that question in rabbinic terminology from 2,000 years ago about whether a woman is obligated, which is still very worthy of consideration, and we are going to talk about more, that setting that to one side, in all other ways and aspects, having 10 people, whether they be men or women, seems to be perfectly fine for this situation. So at the very least, at this place in the logic, the underlying idea that as long as you have a majority of people obligated to a commandment, such as shacharit, if 4 of them happen to be women, even according to this logic, those 4 women could constitute the remainder of the mitzvah, or the remainder of the minyan, and allow you to perform the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem through the performance of shacharit according in all of its fullness. All right, we're going to run out of time if I don't continue down a little bit. For these authorities, all that can be said is that women are ineligible for inclusion simply in a minyan, simply because in terms of derivation of the concept, the term congregation applies only to adult males. As such, it is not from a discrimination, but simply another instance of halakha's recognition of the distinctive roles and obligations of men and women within Judaism. Okay, so what he is trying to round off this conversation with is this doesn't mean we're anti-women. Instead, it's just, hey, look, the term just happens to mean 10 adult men. That's not meant to say that women aren't important. It's not meant to say women don't count. It just works out that way. And it's not discrimination. It's merely distinction. And as such, that's just what it is. Now, personally, I find that deeply unsatisfying because if there is distinction without an underlying explanation for why it mattered, then that is discrimination. It's perfectly fine to say somebody who can lift 500 pounds is the guy I want to be operating the crane, whereas somebody who can only lift 50 pounds is not somebody I want operating the crane. That makes perfect sense. That is a distinction between 2 people based upon a difference that is found between them and a difference which matters to the situation. That is not discrimination. On the other hand, if you say, I want somebody with black hair operating the crane rather than somebody with brown hair operating the crane, you haven't explained to me exactly why that's not discrimination, even though it may be a distinction. And simply saying, well, that's the way it's been done, that's the way we interpreted this line, is not truly satisfying or fulfilling. Indeed, this is one of the reasons why the conservative movement, through the Rabbinical Assembly and the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, has examined in great detail multiple times the role of women within Judaism, and in particular within the minyan. And in this particular tshuva here, written by Rabbi David Fine, Women and the Minyan, he provides a very comprehensive summary of the majority of the opinions that have been discussed within the conservative movement, which deal with women and their status in the minyan. So let's go through his summary, and I'll try and give you a brief explanation of some of them, and then we'll try and come up with a summary for this whole topic. Conservative rabbis who permit women to count in the minyan and serve as shlichot tzibor, as service leaders, argue such by various and opposing argumentations, meaning that there are differences of opinion within the conservative movement, even among those who end up at the same place, that is to say, counting women and letting them lead. Either by reading the classical halakhic sources as obligating to women to prayer equally with men, and thereby permitting them to have equal liturgical status. That is to say, some of my colleagues say that, look, when you look at the actual original classical sources in halakha, whether it be Midrash halakha or Talmud or later texts, there is every reason to see within those sources an obligation to women, or obligation upon women to pray. And although that obligation might have been modified from the man's obligation, the obligation yet remained. And as such, in our own time, in our own congregations, we can recognize that obligation as being sufficient to put them on the bima and to count them in the minyan. So that's one version of how women can be said to be included. Alternatively, by understanding the classical halakhic sources as not mandating the liturgical inequality of women. So this is sort of the opposite. The first version says women were given the obligation. The second text here is saying women were never had the obligation removed from them. That is to say, they don't find it convincing to argue that the classical sources made women have the same obligation, but they also don't find it conclusive that the classical sources took away any obligation or denied them an obligation. If they are not explicitly removed from that category of being obligated, then we can treat them as though they are within that category. If they are not excluded, then to continue to exclude them without an actual explicit exclusion in classical sources doesn't seem right. A third option would be to accept the legislative authority of the 1973 Takana. It's a little more complicated. A Takana is a formal rabbinic declaration, a special edict or enactment that is making an explicit statement of a change for the needs of the community under current circumstances. And indeed, in 1973, there was such a statement regarding the status of women that more explicitly said, look, we know this is not what's been done, but it needs to be done, and we're going to explicitly make legislation that will have it be done. And then we come to position number 4, recognizing that women in the conservative movement have, as a general class, accepted upon themselves the equal obligation to prayer with men. So this fourth status is a little bit, I think, harder to understand, but it is essentially saying, if you look at position number 2, that women never were told they didn't have the obligation. It was simply that they could not exercise that obligation given the social circumstances that surrounded society during the last 2,000 years, when women often lacked an equal amount of freedom, the same way that slaves and minors lacked an equal amount of freedom. Then that does not mean that women don't have the obligation. However, simply removing the social status, the social limitation, doesn't mean that women immediately snap into the category of fully obligated, like category 1 would have said, but instead, there needs to be a more proactive agreement. Now, some have argued that individual women should make that declaration, that a woman should somehow vocally obligate herself to tefillah, to tefillin, to talit, to all of the other mitzvot that were not their obvious obligation for the last 2,000 years, and that thus on a case-by-case basis, some women would count and some women would not. If they had been obligated, but if they had obligated themselves, they would count. If they had not obligated, they wouldn't count. That's generally being considered unwieldy, and more importantly, in this tshuva explains unrealistic, and not just unrealistic, but not capturing the actual essence of the time. That most people do not think of themselves in categories of obligation, that this is not a common concept among men or women. They simply see themselves as being part of the community, and that as such, most men and women see themselves as being obligated to the requirements of the community, that is to say, the observance of the mitzvot, and they see themselves in general as being equally obligated. Now, if an individual woman chooses not to fulfill that mitzvah, whether it be to pray or to wear tefillin or wear talit, that makes no difference on the general sense of obligation any more than if an individual man chooses not to fulfill those mitzvot. And that also has no impact on the general status of other men within the community. That is to say, in the conservative movement, and pardon if this sounds hypocritical, the average person recognizes that there are things we are supposed to be doing, and the average person will often not do the things we are supposed to be doing. That doesn't mean that the average person thinks that they shouldn't be doing them, that they are not obligated to do them. It just means that at the particular moment, they have chosen not to actually do what they believe they ought to be doing. Now, in my opinion, that's not hypocrisy. It's only hypocrisy if you think others should do it and I don't have to. But if you say, I ought to be doing this, but I'm not going to, then you are a human being. Because time and time again, humanity has shown itself quite capable of knowing what is right and choosing not to do it for a whole host of reasons, some of which we've already talked about today. As such, we can say, without fear really of contradiction, that women at large within the conservative movement hold themselves to be equally responsible to the commandments of the congregation, the same way that men hold themselves to be equally responsible to the commandments that are within our community. And even if individuals both occasionally or sometimes never fulfill those obligations, it is not because they do not believe them to be obligations. As such, obligation is not a function of individual practice. Obligation is a function of communal understanding and acceptance. As such, women, whether they realize it or not, and for some of them, whether they want to or not, are obligated to the commandments as equally as men are obligated. Likewise, whether the man wants to be obligated or not. This is one of the important lessons of obligation that comes in Judaism that is often lost in the shuffle of modern conversations regarding individual freedoms and rights, and how I can express myself completely and distinctly from those around me. While Judaism certainly has much room for all of that, it also doesn't give it quite as much leash as perhaps individuals might want. We are not in the conservative movement free as individuals to decide for ourselves what is right and wrong. We can, as individuals, decide what we will do, whether we will do what is right or whether we will not do what is right, whether we will do what is wrong or whether we will avoid what is wrong, but we don't get to redefine those categories. As such, regardless of these four categories that are mentioned here in this tshuva, it is the normative practice both at Temple Israel and the vast majority of conservative congregations to recognize that women are obligated in the commandments equally alongside men, and thus are able to take their place on the bima, to be counted in the minyan, and hopefully to engage in the study that makes them competent at doing both, as well as all the other mitzvot that we are called upon to do as observant Jews. Whether we may miss opportunities from time to time, stumble from time to time, is a given. After all, teshuvah, the act of repentance, is there for a reason. But the status of the individual, the status of our place within the community, is not open for debate and discussion. We are equal in the eyes of God, and all of us have an obligation for Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of God, whether it be through the Kedusha, whether it be through protection of our speech and Lashon Hara, or whether, God forbid, it be in the cases of Kiddush Hashem, more starkly expressed through Rambam. I hope that answered a number of questions, and I hope it also creates a few more. As always, I am always open for a continuing discussion. An hour is never enough to exhaust all that there is to say about any given topic. It's hard to cut it down to 2 pages today, but hopefully you'll avail yourself of many of the sources to read further, and you'll come to me if you have additional questions or would like to pursue this in new places. Take care, everyone.